Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out to this Fireside Chat today. I hope you're excited for an engaging discussion about the past, present, and future of AI and its connection to the fundamental sciences. It's my honor to get us started today to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Shashi Upadhyay. So after receiving his PhD from Cornell University in physics, Shashi transitioned to the world of technology and business. He went on to found his company Lattice Engines, which pioneered predictive cloud applications for marketing and business-to-business sales. After the success of the startup led to an acquisition, Shashi took on a new challenge, taking on a key leadership role at Google as a general manager and vice president. He worked in charge of advertising-facing products and helped transform Google Ads into a data-driven solution. Currently, as president of Zendesk, Shashi is driving the company's vision towards building an AI as a service platform. And last but not least, and I'm sure this is one of Shashi's proudest accomplishments, he is a member of IIT Kanpur's batch of 1987. So please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight's discussion, Shashi Upadhyay.
All right, Sarang, you have a job. That's like the best introduction I've ever heard of myself. I should have brought my kids so they can hear about my accomplishments too. Okay, so I'm, in case you didn't make the connection, Rajesh Gopakumar, a distinguished professor of ICTS and director of ICTS. He and I have been friends since first year of IIT, and I can embarrass him with a lot of different things, but I'll start with a few. When I started at IIT, I'd grown up in a very small town in Bihar, Jharkhand, and Renu and I used to be on the same train. And this whole idea that you could actually study physics as a career never crossed my mind. So I went in with some engineering class, and then I met this guy, and he gave me the ammunition to tell my parents that if the JEE one can go to physics, I can also go to physics. It is okay, it makes it legit. So after my first year, I switched to physics, and then I did a PhD and all that, and then I wandered out, but that's a different story. Rajesh is incredibly accomplished physicist, and it's hard to see that through his modesty. But aside from just being a very inspiring classmate, once he finished IIT, he went to Princeton and worked with David Gross, who is a Nobel laureate and who has actually been here a few times and given talks on behalf of ICTS. And after that, he went to Harvard and was a faculty member there. And unlike many of us who sort of continued on the path of least resistance, he decided to move back to India to really make a fundamental change in how science got done there. Initially, he went to Mehta Institute of Science, which is in Allahabad. It was like a startup. It was, first of all, Allahabad is not the first place you think of when you think of science. It was an upcoming place. He didn't go to TIFR or IISc, the comfortable places. He picked a hard problem, continued to do very world-class science from there. And then at one point, I was a bit surprised when he moved to Bangalore and to be a director. I never thought of him as an administrator. It's like, this guy, he's so talented, why would he take such a job? And then a couple of years later, we kind of reconnected, and I went to visit him to the institute. And I can't tell you, I was just blown away. Like, it's really an incredible place. It's really, it's just hard to describe the energy that's present there. And I spoke to many teams there, including one that was working on atmospheric sciences. And I would not exaggerate in saying that for several days later, I was like thinking of all the ways that you could apply machine learning to some of the problems they're working on. And they were actually not using machine learning. So I bombarded him with 30 different articles, and you guys need to like learn all this stuff, come up to speed on this stuff. You're like going about it all the wrong ways. and so on. So since then, we've been working together to both raise the profile of ICTS, but also to drive kind of more sort of private funds for the institute, because I really do think it can make a very big difference in Indian science, much bigger than the previous ones. So I wandered out of physics for several years, and then I kind of got bored of the business world, and I wanted to make my work a way back into the technical space. And my personal story doesn't matter, but I kind of zoned in on, I need to learn ML, and that's going to be the next thing for my career. So I started a company because nobody was going to give me a job in ML. So that's how I became an entrepreneur with an equally crazy co-founder. Did that for 15 years. Once the company got acquired, I was at Google for several years, and then I left in early this summer, mainly to spend time with my dad, who was visiting from India, and also teenage daughter, who still tolerates me part of the time. So while I was doing that, because I had a lot of time, I ran into Anil's book in a bookstore. The title was like Why Machines Learn, and I was like, okay, this is very fundamental. I know the techniques, I know the engineering methods, but I've never spent a lot of time thinking about why does all this actually work. And this book was so weird, like you open it and it's full of equations. And the first rule of science, popular science writing is, for every equation that you write, I think you lose like 100,000 liters or something like that. So my immediate thought was, this guy is very bored, so I should take this book. And before I knew it, I was reading it in the way I would do things in IIT. I had a paper, pencil, and like taking notes. And a lot of like dead parts of my brain came back online again, matrix multiplication, chain rule, like these things I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about, right, which was soaked in more engineering ideas. So I loved Anil's book, and I was a bit curious about who is this guy who is first of all wrote an excellent book, and not only that, but some of the chapters actually had in them some of the colleagues I was working at Google, and frankly I could start to understand my colleagues better because I would name them, but they're actually very against deep neural networks. And I felt a bit of empathy for them because they had done these amazing things in their history, but the world had passed them by, right? And AI methods had replaced them. I won't give too much away, except to say that the book has by far the best explanation I've ever seen of the Monty Hall paradox. It's really I think I won't tell you about this, but I think the world is divided into two kinds of people: those who get it the first time and those who never get it. And I was definitely in category 2. I understand the calculation, but I never had an intuition. But his explanation nailed it, really nailed it. So I'll leave it as a puzzle for you to go find the book and read it. So he graduated from IIT Madras, was a software engineer. Again, took a difficult path, decided to become a journalist, has worked at New Scientist for several years, and has written 3 excellent books. The Man Who Wasn't There, Through Two Doors at Once, and of course, Why Machines Learn. So today's discussion is about why machines learn, and let's go. Okay, ready? All right. I think one of the things that surprised people, a lot of people this year, that both the Nobel Prize in Physics and Chemistry went to AI researchers. Obviously there was a lot of controversy about this and a lot of curiosity. What do physics and chemistry and fundamental science have to do with AI?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. This is, and the introduction was lovely, and it's truly an honor to be sitting here with the two of you. I think this was partly a sociological phenomenon. The Nobel Committee wanted to potentially get in on the act, given how important deep learning has become over the last decade or so, especially in the last 2-3 years. I think the chemistry Nobel was less controversial. I don't think most people would have a huge objection to the chemistry Nobel. But the physics Nobel going to deep learning researchers, that was the one that caused a lot of controversy. I'm kind of divided, partly because I actually write about both of those stories in my book, so I think I was predisposed to thinking of them as having contributed something very fundamental. In terms of the Nobels themselves, if you look at John Hopfield's work, that definitely was inspired by physics. Is there any actual physics there? No. And the same thing with Hinton's work. Both of them are heavily inspired, but ultimately they are, they're essentially algorithms. And so I can see why there is such a debate about whether they should have been given the Nobel or not. Looking back now, I feel inclined to say that was okay. It was one of those, putting fields into silos is always a problem. So if this allows us to kind of break those silos, so be it.
Yeah, no, thanks firstly, Shashi, for that very embarrassing walk.
Excuse me, could you slightly turn this way? Because we're only seeing the side.
So firstly, thanks Shashi for, it's been a privilege to have Shashi as a friend for the last nearly now 40 years, but
Not that old.
no, we should probably give away.
Not yet 40.
So to kind of be sharing our experiences over all these years, and it's wonderful to be with Anil. Also, like Shashi, I really enjoyed the book, and I think it's something fantastic, especially if you want to go deeper into it, get a real feel for what's going on. But to address your question, Shashi, I think there is the sociological aspect, but if you sort of look beyond that, in the end, it is, I think it's a kind of just about categorization, which is often very artificial, and many disciplines have, these disciplines have always expanded in ways which were not how they were originally formulated, or they grew to encompass many more topics than they originally set out to do. So physics, of course, one thinks of physics as describing nature, phenomena that you see around you, finding laws of these phenomena. But in a way, physics is also a way of understanding things. And it's not just not necessarily just nature. It's a way of viewing the world, its complexity, and trying to analyze it in a way that allows you to develop a certain understanding of it, and maybe a quantitative understanding of it in better and better ways. So I feel we should not necessarily box things into silos, like you said, and it was certainly controversial, but there is, I think the contributions of ideas from physics have been very real, and I think going ahead, the nature of machine learning, and hopefully that will come out a bit in the conversation, is such that I think ideas from physics, from mathematics, neuroscience, computer science, will all play a role in developing the subject further. And I think we are only at the beginning. So in that sense, I feel physics will be an integral part. The physical ways of thinking will be an integral part going ahead too. So the Nobel Prize, yes, it's one kind of a sociological thing in this.
And actually, John Hopfield has an essay where he talks about this exact thing when he was transitioning from being a solid-state physicist to looking for new problems to solve in other fields. He talks about physics as just as a way of thinking, and he's not particularly concerned about the fact that he's not doing physics per se. And so yeah, exactly what Rajesh is talking about.
Yeah, since you brought that, actually I had brought this quote because I found it very remarkable. This was actually in 2014, much before he got the Nobel Prize. And he asks, like, what is physics? And he says, the central idea was that the world is understandable, that you should be able to take anything apart, understand the relationships between its constituents, do experiments, and on that basis be able to develop a quantitative understanding of its behavior. Physics is a point of view that the world around us is, with effort, ingenuity, and adequate resources, understandable in a predictive and reasonably quantitative fashion. Being a physicist is a dedication to the quest for this kind of understanding. So I found that a very beautiful quote, and I thought I would share that.
So some members of the audience may not be familiar with Hopfield or Hinton's work. Anil, are you able to just, in your explanatory style, maybe just describe?
In the presence of a string theorist, I'll try.
And yeah, could you, and then Rajesh, maybe you can talk a little bit about the connection to physics.
I can talk in general terms about what, he was basically, like we just said, he was a solid state physicist who was who felt like he had contributed all he wanted to that field and was looking for something new to do in his career. And in the beginning, he basically was trying to, I think he did a lot of work on looking at the dynamics of biochemical reactions, did some good work there. And then at some point, he honed in on a problem in neuroscience, which is the idea of how do associative memories form and how are they stored in the brain. And to solve that problem using the neural network, he was essentially using a model that is very well known to solid state physicists, physicists in general. It's called the Ising model of ferromagnetism, and he essentially looked at the way the dynamics of these systems behave and used the analogy. It was not a direct translation, but he used it as an analogy to figure out how to construct his neural network, which was a recurrent dynamical neural network. And essentially what that neural network does is you can formulate the network in such a way that it has what's called an energy, and if you store a memory in it, then the state of the network is such that it will be at an energy minimum. And you can just read off the outputs of the neurons and you essentially have the information that constitutes the memory. Now if you were to perturb that system, say if you change the outputs of the neurons, which is akin to basically messing up the memory, then the dynamical nature of the system is such that it will automatically cycle back into the energy minimum, and the energy minimum represents the stored memory, and you just again read off the information and you get back your memory. So assuming, for any given size of network, there's a certain amount of memories you can store before they start corrupting each other. But basically, it was a dynamical system that was completely inspired by the Ising model in physics. Maybe Rajesh can shed more light.
Yeah, just to elaborate a bit more. So physicists often want to understand very complex systems. For instance, many of the materials we see, the phases of even water, when it goes from liquid water to ice or to vapor, these are very difficult to understand from first principles. It comes from the collective behavior of lots of molecules and atoms, and physicists have developed techniques to understand these phenomena in complex systems. And one of the models for magnetism was this Ising model that Anil just mentioned, and which exhibits this sort of behavior that why is a magnet, if you don't heat it up, a magnet has a magnetic field. All the magnets are little magnets inside are kind of aligned with each other, but when you heat it up sufficiently, they don't. It loses its magnetism. So to understand this phenomenon, these models were designed. But the interesting thing is that a very similar model to that, which describes magnetism, could be adapted to understanding these, to capturing these memories. In his case, he wanted to understand these memories and could apply the same ideas that came from physics, namely the memory that you want to access is sort of this minimum of this energy, and then so automatically in a way you are led to that. So the learning process was seen as what physicists call a dynamical process, meaning that's how things would evolve in time to go towards the thing that you're learning. So in that sense, that physical idea came in, that because you have this energy landscape and things want to go towards its minimum, that's how the system will evolve and achieve its minimum. So it was a very, I think, a nice way a very different way from how maybe a computer scientist would think about it. So that, I think, was an important insight, different way of thinking.
Yeah, and in fact, the second Nobel also, Jeff Hinton's Nobel, in terms of his contributions to physics, the network that he had worked on, Boltzmann machines, which are just another kind of recurrent neural network where you add some stochasticity and have some hidden neurons that you can't access as either inputs or outputs. Again, similar ideas that were inspired very deeply by the physics of systems. And what was interesting about Hopfield's work was, once he did this work with recurrent neural networks, solid-state physicists started using that to then make advances in their fields, using that as a model for understanding physical systems. So it's been a back and forth field for a long time now.
So, one of the interesting things is that, like, people have come at this problem from two sides, and the computer science community approached it with, like, what does it even mean to learn something, right? Like, what's the definition of learning? Can you talk a little bit about what does learning actually mean for an artificial system like this? And then back to how do they relate to fundamental ideas, and how does, so things we have learned from testing things like pricing models, how does learning, as seen from the computer science perspective, compare and relate to the way physicists will think about it?
So I think if you just take a very general view of what machine learning is, we're talking of, there are patterns that exist in data, and we are essentially training models that can discern these patterns, and then once they have learned what those patterns are, then we can essentially use that model to make predictions about data that it hasn't seen. In a very simple sense, it's essentially learning about correlations that exist in data. Any model then is capable, once you have trained it, then it somehow embodies the patterns that exist in the data. There are so many different ways in which you can train these models. What the networks like Hopfield networks do, Hopfield networks are a strange, they are not trained in the traditional way. So you kind of design a network with a certain number of neurons, and it's like one shot. You have your data and you can set the weights of the network such that once the weights are set, then the information you want to store represents the energy minimum. So the trick there is to formulate this concept of an energy for a network. Right? And this is a very different kind of learning than what you would see in today's large language models or any of the deep learning systems. Right? So here the Hopfield network has the equivalent of quote-unquote an energy, and learning involves figuring out that whatever pattern you want to learn represents some sort of energy minimum, so that any time you want to access that pattern, you are trying to navigate down to that minimum. And usually these are dynamical systems. So recurrent neural networks, modern deep learning systems, like the ones that are being used at scale, are not recurrent. They are just what are called feed-forward networks. Input comes in, the information flows right to the network, and the output comes out. But Hopfield networks are reverberating. Anytime you change even the output of one neuron, the whole thing starts reverberating. So learning has a very different notion in these energy-based systems. I don't know if that.
That helps.
Yeah, no, I think it is part of this, like a different way of looking at learning, whereas the earlier perceptron models, which started in the 1950s, coming from computer science point of view, had this kind of a more an iterative process where you feed in some inputs, then you see what the output is, and then you correct for it in a particular way, and iterate and go back. It was more procedural, like in a computer program. And you go through certain steps. If this, then this. If not, then that, and so on. And then you try to arrive at, whereas this paradigm was somewhat different from that. The Hopfield one, as Anil just said, is a one-shot thing, but later the Hinton was more probabilistic, but then also it was not a kind of a procedural one in the sense of a program which just learned. You were trying to learn a probability distribution of the data, meaning how is the data, what probabilities would you associate to the data, what kind of weights would you give to your network, which would be able to faithfully reproduce the patterns in the data. And so it was a different paradigm of learning, and I think more or less, if I understand right, the current paradigms are more in that sense of, at the very crude level, of trying to infer the probability distribution, so to say.
So, yeah, exactly. So I think one very sort of bird's eye view way of thinking about what a machine learning model is learning is essentially given some data, it's trying to estimate the probability distribution over the data. And then once you have effectively estimated the probability distribution over data, then you can use it for any task. You can use it for discriminative tasks where you want to distinguish between, say, images of cats versus images of dogs. Or you can use it for generating new data, where once you have that distribution to the best of your ability, if you have estimated that distribution, then you can sample from that distribution, and then that is equivalent to generating something, data that looks like the data it was trained on. So absolutely, like machine learning in a very general sense can be thought of as estimating the ground truth about the data that you have in hand.
So just just a final thing to add over here. I find it personally very interesting, and I'm outsider, I'm not an expert in any sense in machine learning. But what I see as an outsider, but as a physicist, is that this subject has brought in intuition from so many different areas. We just touched upon computer science and physics just now, but as your book also outlines, a lot of it came from neuroscience also. People who had ideas about vision and how our brains process vision, so these ideas have also gone into the learning process. This Hebbian model, which comes from psychology, of neurons that wire together to kind of a crude way. So many different ideas of learning have kind of merged into this pool: physics, mathematics, statistics, computer science, and psychology, neuroscience.
So the fact that this approach, right, of guessing the probability distribution and then using that to infer, right? So given a query, provide an answer. The fact that that obviously works in the world of words, right? But increasingly, you're seeing that also work in the world of images, and that works in the world of music. Like, is it telling us something about reality that we don't really understand?
Yeah. So I recently had a conversation with a professor at NYU about something very similar to the question that you're asking. He's looking at this whole question of whether transformers, which is the architecture that underlies modern large language models, whether these are so-called universal learners. So in machine learning, there is something called a no free lunch theorem, which basically means that if you train your model to be very good at solving one particular problem, it's probably going to be terrible at solving something else, and there's not, the theorem basically says that you cannot have one machine learning model that is equally good at solving a whole range of, or all of the different kinds of problems. But it turns out that the transformer architecture is actually very good at dealing with text, it's very good at dealing with images or in audio. I mean, you have to work to massage the data, but essentially it's very good at dealing with different modes of data. And the question then comes, how come is the transformer not subject to the no free lunch theorem? It turns out that the reason why it is so effective at solving different kinds of problems is because there is something very common about all the different modes of data. He was analyzing it in the context of something called Kolmogorov complexity, and I'll leave the explanation of that to Rajesh. But he was basically pointing out that all of these different modes of data about the natural world, they are not, they're all actually quite similar. So the fact that the transformer is actually very good at dealing with all these different kinds of data is not a violation of the no free lunch theorem, because these data are all very, very similar. So there is something about the data of the natural, that represents the natural world, that has similar characteristics. So I think that gets at what you were asking.
It does, and I was hoping you would talk about how we live in a simulation, things like that. But
well, Bayesian analysis would say 50-50 chance.
So you didn't go there. Rajesh, this is kind of a question for you, right? Like you're a professional physicist. You've been working in string theory for a long time, so you're used to seeing things from a very fundamental physics point of view, right? Like, do you really you have a different definition of understanding than most of us do, right? Your bar is very high. So when you look at these systems, what questions come to mind about how you would go about actually understanding, like, why do they do what they do? Why are they so good at doing what they do, right? Like, how do you think about that problem?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very critical question to ask going ahead, because at the moment most of the things that we see are very empirical, so to say. These things work, they work remarkably, we don't understand why. In what terms do we want to understand it? What does understanding mean when we say that we want to understand why this works? Like your title, why machines learn. So again, different people have different levels of understanding. Physicists, I think, like I read from Hoffield's quote, like to, at some level, take apart things, but then put them together in a way which, such that the phenomena that are emergent, so to say, coming out of the complex system are highlighted. So you want to know, to understand the system. So like when we want to understand a complex system like water, we are not trying to understand many microscopic details of it. We want to get to understand it at a level which enables you to say, to capture its in a way the most relevant features. So in the case of machine learning, I think probably the problem is that we haven't figured out what is the most relevant feature when we say that something is understanding, meaning physicists, okay, I don't want to use too much jargon, but physicists talk about something called an order parameter for many complex systems. What is the thing that distinguishes this state from something else? Is there something very broad that distinguishes two states, like a liquid from a solid or more complex system? So I think so we seem to have, we seem to be in a state where these networks have crossed a threshold and have a phase transition, so to say, to a different level of understanding complexity and being able to capture complexity from what say, the very simple models wouldn't have been able to do. So what characterizes that sharp jump? I think as a physicist, that's what I would want to know, that is there a way to precisely characterize an order parameter in the jargon again. But since we don't have that, that's why I'm sort of, I think, struggling to articulate it, because I think we don't have that language to ask. But that's part of the way in which you would want to understand. Develop a language or a criterion for characterizing understanding.
I completely agree. In particular with deep neural networks, compared to sort of earlier machine learning models, where when you are trying to train a model, you would decide what features about your data are relevant and use those features as important things that the machine learning model is going to pick up on. We already decide upon those features. What's happened with deep learning is that it's internally figuring out what the necessary features are. So if you're trying to teach it to separate out images of cows from images of dogs, normally if you were trying to figure out the features beforehand, before you fed it to the model, you would come up with long floppy ears as being some feature, or something that's relevant to a dog versus something that's relevant to a cow. For all you know, the machine learning model is just picking up on the fact that all cows are standing in meadows, and the background color green is more important rather than the cow in the foreground. So, there's no way of looking at the network and figuring out what the features are that it has picked up on. So one of the things about understanding what deep nets are doing is a question of interpretability. We can't really interpret the weights or the parameters of the network to figure out how it's doing whatever it's doing. That's one thing. The other thing is more along the lines of what Rajesh was just saying, is that when we have these large systems like large language models, their behavior, because we are making them bigger and bigger, there is definitely quote-unquote emergent behavior. Things that you did not see in models that were an order of magnitude smaller suddenly show up in models that are bigger. And there are efforts to come up with effective theories to explain why we see these emergent behaviors. So that would be the one level of understanding. And a lot of the interpretability people are after the deeper level, where they really want to look at the weights and say, okay, this is what the network is doing. But that's a very, very hard problem to crack, even for small networks, let alone these large language models.
Right. So might be misplaced also, I feel, sometimes to focus on the when you focus too much on the weights, the nitty-gritties, you're probably losing sight of the bigger picture.
I mean, it is an emergent phenomenon after all, right? So coming more to the human side of the story, one of the things I really liked about your book was you tell the story of your interactions with people and like the way these ideas developed very, very well. So who's your favorite character in the book, and any interesting anecdotes that you'd like to share in your interactions with them?
I mean, there were a lot of people that were pretty amazing. I think the person that stands out for me is someone called Bernie Whitrow. So when I talked to him, he was probably already in his late 80s, and that was a few years ago. He's a professor emeritus at Stanford, and he, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was one of the people, along with Frank Rosenblatt, at Cornell, and Whitrow was at Stanford. He was one of the first people to design the first artificial neuron. And the story that was just amazing was that one Friday afternoon, Whitrow is in his office, and a young grad student comes knocking at his door. The grad student is looking to talk to Whitrow to figure out what research is going on so that he can decide whether to sign on to work with Whitrow or not. And Bernie Whitrow, goes up to the blackboard and starts describing a problem that he's trying to solve. And in the course of 2 hours, this young grad student and Bernie Whitrow together end up, discovering or creating what is now called the least mean squares algorithm, which is one of the most fundamental algorithms in machine learning. When you would hear of the algorithm backpropagation that is used to train modern deep neural networks, well, the least mean square is the true sort of precursor to modern day backpropagation. And this was done literally in the course of an afternoon. And they were just trying to discuss what project to work on, and they end up figuring out this algorithm. It's Friday afternoon. These are people who are building things. So they go across the hall. There's apparently an analog computer there, and this kid whose name, by the way, is Ted Hoff, who turned out to be one of the people behind the first Intel microprocessor. But anyway, he goes and there's an analog computer across the room, and he just quickly programs it and figures out that the algorithm works. And then by then it's evening, Friday evening, and they want to build this in hardware, and the Stanford supply room is closed. So they walk across to the local sort of electronics store, buy a whole bunch of parts, go to Ted Hoff's apartment, and over the course of the weekend, they build the world's first artificial neuron in hardware. And Monday morning, that thing is working, right? And literally that algorithm, all your DSL modems runs, they run those algorithms. And it really is the precursor to modern day backpropagation. And when I heard that story, and this is a 80-plus-year-old man narrating very clearly what happened in 1958. It was quite amazing.
That's a really good story. There are a bunch of startup people here. You should be working on weekends, man. What are you doing here? Take some inspiration. Question to you, Rajesh. So we've talked a lot about understanding the physics of AI, or like the inner workings of it. But the thing that has got a lot of attention recently is how AI, as it is, not as an understood, but still to be understood object, is actually helping advance the frontier of sciences, right? And especially in chemistry, biology, atmospheric sciences, predicting weather, it's really doing amazing things. Can you talk a bit about what the promise of this is in the more fundamental sciences and physics and mathematics? Can AI actually help us move the frontier on that? Answer the question about multiple universes or dark matter, things like that. Dark energy, actually.
Yeah, no, it's probably a little foolhardy for me to predict, but definitely a lot is being used. So the zeroth level is the way in which I think many people use AI to make sense of large amounts of data. And in physics, in astrophysics, for instance, there's humongous amounts of data. I think probably the largest amounts of data are generated through all the astrophysical probes that we have. You might have all heard of the James Webb Space Telescope. So many other instruments up in the sky, looking at the sky, satellites, etc., which are trying to figure out about distant galaxies, black holes, gravitational waves, the origin of the universe, cosmology. So there's a lot of data that's coming in, which which cannot be humanly analyzed. And in fact, over, I think, maybe even 10 years ago, probably, at least in the physics community, I think the astrophysicists and the particle physicists were the ones who first caught on to the potential to make discoveries using this. So, for instance, there are these objects called transients in the sky. So a supernova is the most striking example. A supernova flares up in the sky. Most of the time it's not visible to us, but it's visible in the telescopes and the sophisticated instruments. And you would like to know, you would like to be able to detect where those supernova have happened, which parts of the sky, is it correlated with many other things, etc. So that kind of detecting transients has now been automated. There are these big telescopes, the Mount Palomar telescope and so on. I think there's actually a global network of telescopes which keeps tracking the sky, and you get automated messages whenever these are detected. So, and similarly in the the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, people actually have to, there is again, when people collide these particles to discover new particles or test the existing theories, there's again huge numbers of, huge amounts of data which are again filtered through this. So that's the 0th level, I would say, where it's a tool, a useful tool. People are beginning to use it. You asked about multiverses. Actually, in our area, I mean, in string theory, there is this notion that there is an energy landscape, very much like we had in the Ising model or Hopfield's thing, but the universe itself, there might be, fundamentally, there might be many possible minima, and maybe we are in one of them, but there could be many others, which is the idea of the multiverse. But how do you search? Your theory gives you some predictions for this landscape, this energy landscape, and you want to find which of those wells in that landscape you might be in, and there could be something like even like 10 to the 500 such minima, and so to find that even for a theoretical physicist is impossible. And people have been trying to develop techniques to efficiently look for where our universe might be, the parameters that govern our universe, where they might be hidden in this landscape. People are also, I think, trying to begin to use it for maybe more in mathematics, especially. I think people are trying to generate new questions from especially the generative AI, the large language models. People have been trying to uncover new mathematical facts using the existing ones and try to generate new mathematical theorems. And I think it has had modest success. Personally, I feel to be a very intrinsic part of scientific the process. Machine learning has to evolve to another stage. Because the way we understand it comes back to your earlier question of understanding. How do we want to understand things? And in physics, we build frameworks, we build theories. We're not necessarily trying to fit something to some model or a curve. That's usually just the beginning. But real understanding comes from having a theory like Maxwell's theory of electricity and magnetism, or quantum mechanics, and so on. And I think that requires a certain level of abstraction, and connecting abstract concepts. I think we are not yet there, though I wouldn't predict that we'll never get there.
But your next grad student is not an AI, right?
No.
But saying that, there are some very interesting, in fact, I'm just about in the process of writing a piece about this topic, and one of the, to take an example to illustrate what Rajesh just said, machine learning algorithms now are capable of detecting symmetries in data. Right? So, for instance, they have trained models to be able to look through data that's been collected at the Large Hadron Collider, the CMS experiments, and they can find symmetries, including Lorentz symmetries. So symmetries are basically, data that is invariant to transformations. And so the point that these physicists are making is we can actually find a lot of symmetries. Finding symmetries is not the problem. But you need somebody like Einstein to take a Lorentz symmetry and then turn that into a whole theory. And that level of understanding AIs today don't have. But they are already very good at doing some of the other things that might be very hard for humans in terms of searching for a vast space of possible solutions. There are people in Vienna who have been using AI to design new quantum optic circuits. So if they want, for instance, 4 photons that are entangled in a very particular kind of state, they have developed this graph-based AI where they can optimize it to find a circuit given all the possible experimental elements that you can have on the optical bench. And it turns out that sometimes it finds solutions that at first blush seem very strange. And when you start analyzing those solutions, you realize that it has actually discovered a circuit that humans hadn't thought of at all. And by looking at those circuits, you learn something more about the physics. It hasn't discovered anything new per se, but it's just the fact that these systems can search so effectively through a really large space of solutions that allows us to discover things much more effectively.
So just maybe a concrete thing which I would be impressed with as a step is in the 1600s, Tycho Brahe, astronomer sitting in a remote island in Denmark, for 10 years he observed the night sky very carefully, charted out the positions of every planet at that time that was visible, and it was from that data, so he had exquisite data, it was from that data that Kepler inferred certain laws that govern planetary motion, but the challenge would be just from that data, okay, I can imagine something getting the Kepler's laws, which tell you that basically things move in ellipses, or there are certain other laws of the time periods and the distances. But can you then come up with the Newton's equations and that gravity, the gravitational force, which goes like 1 over the distance square? Can you come up with that as the explanation for these orbits? So that would be a challenge. I would love to, I'm not saying can only.
Yeah, but can you even do it if you don't have an embodied AI, right? I mean, what we have today, I just learned everything from the internet and a few books.
So it's interesting that you bring up the Kepler thing. In 2019, when I wanted to teach myself deep learning, so I had a fellowship at MIT, and the project I proposed as part of my desire to learn about deep learning was, I'm going to try and see if I can build a deep net that can do what Kepler did. And literally within 2 weeks, it was very clear that that's not going to be possible, because there's very little data. Like if you look at what Tycho Brahe's observations are, it's just a handful of observations of the orbits of positions of Mars and Jupiter, and Kepler infers this whole set of laws based on that. And very soon it became obvious that I had to write a simulator to generate tens of years of data for this deep learning system to have any hope of figuring out a pattern. But even there, all it figures out is that, oh, this is an ellipse. That doesn't translate to some symbolic understanding or even a symbolic equation that easily, right? Let alone some deep understanding. So we are some ways away from that level of.
So maybe the last question before we open up to questions from the audience. Clearly these artificial neural networks can do amazing things, but clearly they lag biological neural networks in a major way, right? Despite the biological neural networks consuming much less energy, needing to sleep for 12 hours a day or whatever, 8 hours a day, eat 3 times a day, and other flaws. But one of the unique things that at least the materialist believe is, sort of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon of biological networks, independent of what your philosophy is about that. I mean, you wrote a book about the notion of self, and the manual wasn't there, etc. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is the connection. Is there any connection between artificial neural networks and inner states of awareness? And do you think that if we keep going down this path of scaling, we'll eventually get there, or like, should we worry about are we bringing new form of life into this planet? And
so yes, no, maybe, I don't know what that is. So I think the first thing you said, that you have to make this assumption first, that the materialist perspective about our brains is the correct perspective to have, in the sense that our consciousness is simply a material process. And if that is correct, and if there are computations that are happening in our biological neural networks that are giving us this sense of being conscious, without even trying to define what consciousness is, right? If that is correct, then there is no in principle reason why artificial neural networks also cannot, it doesn't even have to be neural networks per se. Any kind of computational system that manages to replicate the computation that are happening in our brains, why they won't get there also. And it doesn't have to do with scale, in the sense that scale may be necessary for a certain level of intelligence, etc. I think awareness and sentience and consciousness is kind of orthogonal to intelligence. So, I personally don't see that as an in-principle, there's no in-principle objection to that. So, we are going in that direction if, with the big caveat, if the materialist conception is correct, right? We could be wrong there, right? If that's not the case, then all bets are off as to what will happen with AI. But will machine learning systems or artificial intelligence ever come to a point where it is quote-unquote aware of itself and conscious of itself? All of those things are, computationally speaking, the outcomes of models, like first order models of the environment and of itself, then second order models of the models, and so you can get a hierarchy of modeling going on, and which is what we think is happening in our brains. If we can replicate that, then entirely possible. And already there are, like, you can read philosophers today who will argue that modern AI systems, while they don't have kind of any sense of being aware or being conscious in a persistent way, they may have flashes of it. And it won't be like an LLM saying, hey, I am an LLM. That's not the point. It's more about having the right kind of models emerging inside these systems that have the capacity to represent information in a certain way. But because these are feed-forward systems, as soon as the computation just proceeds through the network, it's just literally a flash of something and gone, right? It doesn't persist. With recurrent neural networks, with dynamical systems, who knows?
You want to add anything, Rajesh, or you want to stay away from the topic of consciousness, like all good physicists?
Well, I remember when we were in IIT Kanpur, a course that I enjoyed very much was on the theory of the mind by Barua. I don't know if you remember the course, and I even wrote a term paper in that course on this. There's a beautiful collection of articles called The Mind's Eye by Douglas Hofstadter. So in fact, one of the essays there was in that collection was about the brain in a vat, as they were calling it. What does it mean? Whether you need an embodied, of course that time, this was 80s, so there was no idea of AI, but there was a thought experiment of a brain in a vat and a disembodied brain, and to what extent it can capture the external universe and so on. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I don't think I have anything profound to add, except that I also believe that that what we call consciousness may arise in many substrates, not necessarily our biological one, which is probably an evolutionary accident or an evolutionary fact, but it might arise in other substrates and other forms. The question of whether there's if the consciousness itself is of a different nature, are there many different kinds of consciousnesses? Maybe that is something, maybe we are finding out that there are different ways of being conscious. In fact, we don't even understand in what way many animals are conscious. And I was fascinated by this idea of octopuses and squids, which people say are the closest to an alien intelligence. They have a very different neuronal architecture. They don't have a centralized brain, and they kind of feel things. It's a kind of a distributed neuron system. And but at the same time, they're able to learn. They're able to do many things, which incredible learning. There are some fantastic YouTube videos on how octopuses actually learn things. So it's clearly different kinds of architectures. Even we already know in the biological setup lead to different kinds of probably these are different kinds of consciousness when we don't even have models for those. So what machine learning is probably giving us is yet another kind, which is not even biological.
So the mystery remains. Okay, I think we're going to open this up to the audience. Any questions? There are 2 microphones, and you can borrow one from here if you'd like. So,
And that's,
yeah, and I'll repeat the questions if you're not able to walk to the mic. Yeah.
Should I bring it to you?
This question is for Anil. I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you have talked about it. You said that machine learning is really based on human brain understanding of the neural network, right? And learning is very closely connected to memory. And if you really learn something and if you can't recall it, it's of no use. So my question is, do neuroscientists understand what memory is made of? Are they really collages of images, or are they collection of neural electrical impulses and nerve impulses? And if you don't really have an understanding of how memory is made, how can it be translated to machine learning, memory, all of that?
So I think we should clarify something. All machine learning is not based on our understanding of how brains work. There's a whole bunch of machine learning that is non-neural network based. And even the neural network based machine learning, the neurons that we model in software are extremely simplistic models of biological neurons. So if you look at the structure of artificial neural network, it is honestly nowhere in terms of complexity. It is nothing like biological neural networks, which are way more complex. The notions of what memory is in an artificial neural network versus what it is in a biological neural network are totally different. At this point, I don't think, in fact, I think we have a neuroscientist in the audience, I don't know where. We know this there somewhere. In terms of asking about, do we fully understand how our brains store and retrieve memories? Not fully, of course not. Yeah, we have some ideas, but we definitely don't have a full understanding. And what we are building with artificial neural networks at this point, honestly, there is very little correspondence between the artificial ones and the biological networks. The biological networks are fundamentally more complicated. Even at the level of a single neuron, even a single biological neuron, you would require an entire artificial neural network to model one neuron, let alone 100 billion of them. So I think we shouldn't. It's a long way from replicating biological systems.
Thank you for that wonderful discussion. I think it's been known for a long time that there are deep connections between information and physics. Yes, there was a reason von Neumann recommended to Shannon that he should name his quantity information entropy. We've known about connections between physics and computation, and I guess we have proof that the laws of physics allows for intelligence to exist in the universe. Do we know what fundamentally is it about the laws of physics that allow for intelligence? What are the deep connections that exist between physics and intelligence? The laws of physics and intelligence.
Physicist.
Certainly, the laws of physics permit intelligence. We have existence proof of that. But what it is about the laws of physics, maybe that was your question, that what it is about the laws of physics that bring about intelligence, I don't think we have a clue. It's, I think, an emergent behavior, but that's just another way of saying that we don't understand it. But we do understand other kinds of complex emergent behaviors, so we think that this will also perhaps be understood. And in some ways the neural networks give some glimpse of how a certain kind of intelligence can arise out of the laws of physics, in a sense. The laws of, you can view them through models like this kind of spin glass or Ising-like model that Anil mentioned.
I guess I'm also asking, we know that there are mathematically sound connections between computation and physics.
Right.
Are we any closer to something similar between physics and intelligence?
I mean, can I say? So, I think there are efforts underway to show how self-organized systems are kind of a thermodynamic imperative, right? I mean, so there's a whole bunch of computational neuroscience and other people looking at this. And if self-organization is a thermodynamic imperative in a non-equilibrium system, then simple self-organized systems then lead to complex ones, and once that chain is set in motion, then you can literally look at how evolution has proceeded, and intelligence is a given, right? Because it is in the nature of the physical system that it needs to model the outside world in order to preserve its self-organization, and that is the beginnings of basically intelligence in a very rudimentary form, and in a very coarse way of thinking about humans. That's what our brains are doing. Our brains are constantly modeling the environment outside and making predictions about what we're going to encounter moment by moment. And the reason for that is thermodynamic efficiency, right? So it is being driven by physics. So somebody had asked me, why did I call my book Why Machines Learn? Because I use it as a very loose term. I'm saying that the rationale is math, but actually if you really ask the question deeply, it has to be physics. And somewhere it has to be physically necessary for systems to self-organize and become what they become. And people are working on it. So I don't think it's a fully solved problem yet.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thanks for a great conversation. Okay, I think it's better. You brought up the topic of model interpretability, and I was curious to dive deeper into that, right? And I'm just wondering, if our models are very accurate, very good, what does interpretability add to the conversation? If you could just elaborate a little bit on, what is the importance of interpretability, I guess, assuming we have good models.
But good is always in the context of the data you're testing on, right? And in a sense, in order to really understand the insights of a model, to be able to verify that it is actually doing what you think it's doing, interpretability would be important. But there are also arguments to be made for why you should just treat the whole thing as a black box, and as these things get more complex, there are many people who argue that we're not going to get to that level of interpretability, of the level of the single weights, trying to figure out what a bunch of weights are representing, etc. So maybe the better way is to just look at what Rajesh was saying, the effective theories for emergent behavior. If you can explain it at some coarse-grained level, that may be enough. So the reason for wanting to interpret what's happening is partly academic. People really do want to understand how these things are working, and the other part is mostly sociological. We will encounter situations where systems are making decisions where you may not agree with the decision, right or wrong. And like right now, if you go to some, I don't know, if there's some situation where a human has made a decision and it turns out that the decision was wrong, there's some accountability there. You can figure out how that whole thing came about, and you can have a back and forth with the person about the reasoning process. That is not possible right now. If we give up all the responsibility of decision making to quote unquote these black box systems, then we'll end up in a place where it may not be able to, who do you hold accountable at that point, right? So some of these interpretability efforts have to do with social concerns and cultural concerns.
Also for applications, interpretability is actually really important, because a lot of the use cases of AI are a human has to use it to do something better, and they need to be able to inspect what was done, right, in order to build confidence that the recommendation that the AI is making is actually valid, right? Now, most of the current systems, if you play with them, every time you ask them a question, they actually give you a slightly different answer, and that limits their your ability to use them in. For example, if you need a very reliable system, right? Let's say you're using this to do fraud detection, or you're using it to, kind of a classic business application, process returns. So someone calls you and says, I don't like the product and I want a refund or something like that, right? Historically, those things have been done in a very logical, step-by-step. There's a if-then statement that you go through and then you decide if it's okay to return or not, or pay a refund. When you put an AI in the middle of it, and if it's making one decision versus the other, you don't want to find out too late why it made that decision. So you need that ability to inspect every step of the way and why it's doing what it's doing. So interpretability research is actually very important specifically for, it's important for fundamental reasons, just to understand what's going on. But it's also important for application reasons. And most businesses would actually trade off accuracy and performance over interpretability. Like they'll give up some on one side so that they can understand it better.
So just to elaborate a little on that, the academic aspect of interpretability, as I understand it, there's an analogous thing that has happened in physics, which is in trying to understand complex systems and building these coarse-grained descriptions, which are effective descriptions in a way which are easily understandable. You have learned how to then design new materials, new phases of matter. So many of the very remarkable new states of matter or materials that have come because we have understood things at a kind of a coarse-grained level. That enables you to actually search for newer kinds of states. And similarly, I would imagine that if we had a similar interpretable idea of intelligent learning, we would be able to design new kinds of architectures, which would perhaps enhance this. So in a way, to even go beyond what we currently have, I feel this would be important.
Yes. No, thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, by the way, this is not a question, sorry, this is not a question, but a suggestion for Anil. First, I liked your book very much. In physics, so, and economics, right? You go between theory and practice, and theory and practice, something that cannot be go to the next thing. So I like your approach, and by the way, I like the fact you have even the more recent people who may not be well known, but certainly experts in the area. Okay. So I have a suggestion following up on that, right? I would say preceding deep learning, which is when, of course, obviously this whole thing got to be well known. Poor Jeff was hammering away for 30 years. But if you look at reinforcement learning, that story is wonderful. And with deep RL, it's even more so, this back and forth sort of thing. So I would strongly suggest that you write a book on that as well.
Well, thank you. I'll take that as our advice.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. RL is a big deal, and I think we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, but also, if you look at the first chapter of the second edition of certain part of the book, that gives you a very nice roadmap, including what makes learning work. And so, to me, I keep talking to people about is the reward system, because if you think of RL, it's predated by stochastic automated learning in the Russian work, right? So the question then becomes way back, going back to the 60s in automation and remote control and so on. So then the issue becomes, since the neural net or this whole single algorithm which this whole scaffolding has been built on, right? So you can similarly ask a question in reinforcement learning, is the fact that reward structure is what makes reinforcement learning work? Are there other mechanisms to learn? But anyway, so I leave that to you because you're a great journalist. I love the way you mix the things together. And as someone who works in the area, I really like the fun part very much indeed.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for this wonderful talk. So along the lines of book suggestion, I'm also going to ask you about writing a book where you speak about how machines are built. So I'm a physicist, turned into an LLM scientist right now. When I was doing physics PhD, the model size I was dealing with was, let's say, maximum 10 parameters. And interpretability was easy for having a 10 parameter space model. The models I'm dealing with right now in LLM space are 600 billion plus parameters, so interpretability is definitely a faraway dream. What I find interesting is not just trying to understand how the machines learn, but also how they are built. For example, the transformer architecture was not built by one person overnight. It definitely has taken many iterations over many years, and trying to understand all of those iterations and how they reach that specific architecture design is something that I find very fascinating. I'm not sure how much physics insight is involved there. It's definitely more engineering and more architecture heavy, but I would like to understand if you can just give a broad idea of what's your take about those kinds of scalability design.
Oh, so why machines learn, actually, I don't deal with the transformer architecture in that book, but the other ideas, that is the motivation, trying to figure out sort of the history of the field. It's not just about saying, okay, here's how a deep neural network works, but trying to come at it from a historical perspective, to look at all the various things that people did that brought us to this point. So I completely agree with you. Understanding the path to how we got here is a huge part of sort of making sense of what's happening. And as it happens, I'm writing an afterword for the paperback, which is about the transformer. So my head is right now a little bit full of that crazy architecture.
Hello. Thank you for the great talk. I had a question regarding, neuromorphic materials, research on neuromorphic materials for neuromorphic computing. So research is at its very novel stage for neuromorphic materials right now, but there are significant advancements being made in terms of their electrical properties. Now, if we try to understand the physics of those, like Dr. Rajesh said, going into the nitty-gritties of it, we might lose sight of the big picture, and that might hinder its advancement. But at the same time, we can't have advancement unless you know the nitty-gritties of neuromorphic materials. I was wondering what your take on this was.
Yeah, it's always a very fine balance. I think even in condensed matter physics, in the study of many of these new quantum materials, people need to know a lot about individual compounds, chemical structures, and so on. But it's just knowing the right amount. It's very difficult to define that, but I mean, you want certain characteristics, maybe that's available in a certain class, which would realize, so it depends again where you're coming from. If you're really in the process of building these materials, maybe building a better high temperature superconductor or some other such thing, you probably want to, so then you want to optimize on some properties. You want the highest temperature, in which case the nitty-gritties become very important. You may have the broad theory, the broad understanding, but but that's very general, and then you will need to get into the nitty-gritty. So it depends a little on the question you're asking, and but definitely at some level, nitty-gritties you would need to tackle them if you're attacking a certain kind of question.
Okay, thank you.
I think this question is for Anil. So I'm a lay person, and like most people, I got quite surprised when ChatGPT came out. And since then, what I understand is that you have a cluster of nodes, a cluster of 10,000 nodes or something, which you use to train to create a large language model. And then there are a few people or a few companies who are doing this, right? You have a few different, like Meta, OpenAI, and Google. What are the different kinds of model training that you see happening other than this large language model in the next few years? Do you have any insights into that, or when you spoke to all these different researchers, have they discussed anything that's coming up that's again going to shock us, like ChatGPT?
I think it's really hard to say what will shock us. Like if you just go back to 2016 and try to ask yourself what's going to shock us, I don't think anyone would have said the transformer paper that came out in 2017, right? So it might just be one or two papers that come out like that and suddenly something else blows up. But saying that, there is a certain level of appreciation about the limitations of large language models already, right? As amazing as they are, we still have not solved the problem of getting them to generate factually correct responses all the time, right? And that is an in-principle problem with the way the system is architected. I mean, it's always a probabilistic output, so there's always a chance that it will be wrong. And unless you have external verifiers looking at what the outputs are, we don't have a way of. So, whatever needs to come next, we'll have to address that. There's also this question of data efficiency. LLMs are extremely hungry when it comes to the amount of data they consume. If you compare that to how much data humans use to learn something, there's a vast gulf, right? And even accepting for the fact that human brains have been evolving for hundreds of millions of years in animals, and hence these nervous systems have encountered data over evolutionary time. Even accounting for that, our systems are very, very data efficient. So there is something about the architecture of our learning systems that seems to be radically different than what LLMs are doing. So you will see like people attacking these problems along these various axes, data efficiency, energy efficiency. Energy efficiency will also tie in with neuromorphic hardware at some point. It's really hard to say where the next breakthroughs will come. Right now, the industry is kind of myopically focused on large language models, and all indications are that things are saturated. This is not to say that they're not amazing. They are, and it's been quite magical to see what has happened. Almost no one anticipated what has happened, especially if you look at the way these things are built, the way they are trained. We understand the mathematics of how to build them and how to train them, but there was no indication in all of that math of the emergent behavior. So things have been quite startling. I think Shashi mentioned embodiment, right? I think AI systems that are embodied in the context of robotics, etc., where the systems are learning about the environment by interacting with the environment, whether it's a physical environment or a virtual environment, and learning about representing the world from the ground up. LLMs are basically top-down machines. We have taken all of our human written language and given them that information. But if a robot were to encounter the world in virtual life or in real life, and learn about the world and learn to represent the world internally, those representations will have what philosophers call, their symbols to be grounded in physical reality. Right now, LLM symbols are not grounded in physical reality. So those kinds of things, it might take one or two small innovations and suddenly things will again take off.
So I have one, basically, what is your thought on what is intelligence? I mean, are those systems inherently intelligent, or because we perceive them to be intelligent? In the sense, for example, like animals or squid, or like you're talking about, do they know they're intelligent, or because I perceive them to be intelligent, so I know that they are intelligent? For example, physical laws, they define intelligence in the universe system, like gravitational waves or black holes, and all these laws follow perfect, there are hardly any violations. So you can say like the weather pattern, for example, is intelligent if I describe it. And that's same true for the animals too. So my question is, are these systems actually intelligent, or it is my perception of them being intelligent? Or in other words, what is intelligence exactly? Is the guy who's looking at it who's defining intelligence? Or, like maybe if I know that I'm intelligent, or I don't know, like, what do you think about that question?
You might be also trying to make a distinction between self-awareness and intelligence.
What I'm trying to say exactly. So basically, the weather pattern doesn't know about its own intelligence, or the weather pattern, or the planets, or whatever, right? But we perceive them to follow the animals itself. So I don't know if that question ties up. I was hesitant to go there. but helping. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I think Anil has a part of his book where he talks about the theory of mind, I think, and touching on some of these topics. I think we try to develop a theory of mind when we see the responses of someone else. We are kind of, we are all constantly doing that. So I think we do that with people, and so we do tend to anthropomorphize when we see ChatGPT say some things, which perhaps is an extrapolation. It's probably not. We do that with cats and dogs also. I mean, so it's not surprised that we do it with ChatGPT. But whether it is intelligence, I think comes back to the earlier question. We don't still have a very good understanding of what it means to be. How do you characterize conscious intelligence? So it may well be. I mean, maybe, yeah. So I think we are still not at a stage where we can sharply ask this question.
So, I mean, all the definitions of intelligence as they exist today assume that there is an observer, I mean, a human observer who's the referee. And then, I mean, if you break that assumption, then everything breaks down.
So there's no inherent intelligence.
I don't think there's but then who defines that inherent intelligence, right? So it's sort of a closed loop argument. Yeah, so no, there isn't. I think you have to assume that there's a human being defining what intelligence means, and then systems either meet those criteria or don't meet that criteria. So we have one last question, and Rajesh should have a few minutes to talk about ICTS.
Hi everybody, my name is Trabir. I'm not the scientist. The only thing I remember is E equals MC squared, so level set everything. I'd like to bring this back to something somebody said about, in terms of layman terms, right? There's a lot of words being used when it comes to application. There's always this fear that will it ever be informed or intelligent enough? But the truth is, I'm curious, can we ever mimic human behavior? Because there's so many dimensions to that, whether it's through feelings, whether it's through past experiences, whether through its limitations of the way the brain is designed. The actions and outcomes are always different. So can we ever get to a point where we have a perfect system?
Perfect in the sense of emulating the human? That may not even be the goal of AI in terms of emulating a human in its entirety. They're just, I think they're after trying to figure out general principles that constitute intelligence. And since we can't even define that term properly, that the whole effort is already slightly in a gray zone. But I don't think I don't think LLMs, the way we are building them, are going to come anywhere close to the way humans function. But saying that, you should also remember that LLMs have capacities that in some ways go way beyond the capacity of a single human. You and I will never be able to imbibe the entire internet. These things have, right? And that gives them certain abilities that an individual human will never have. So I think it's coming to a point where we are beginning to now compare apples and oranges. Like I think I have sat in conferences where researchers who are working on this problem will confess that when they look at the functioning of these systems, they feel like they are, again, this is humans ascribing something to the artificial system, but they say that they feel like they're in the presence of an alien intelligence. It works differently. It doesn't necessarily work in the way our brains work. So I'm not sure that all of the AI people are after replicating human behavior. I think even if we can do certain things that humans do really well in an artificial system, that would be a huge achievement. And there's still gaps.
Can I just add a comment to that, what you just said? It is, no, I'll just speak. I think this example was in chess, when AlphaGo played chess. It was very unlike how humans play chess. I think there are people analyzing the games and so on, and the games that were played between machines were just unlike games that humans would play. So that's like going this way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When in that famous victory that AlphaGo had against the world's best Go player. I forget the move. There was a move that it made. I think it even has a name now, move number 17 or something. That almost everyone who was looking at that move wondered how on earth did it make that move. And it turned out that a lot of it has to do with its capacity to search through the space of all possible moves in ways that humans can't. But nonetheless, it had discovered something pretty unique. Now, today's Go players are actually, it has already impacted how Go is played by humans, because they are now learning about the way AlphaGo plays Go, and they have changed their ways of thinking about how to play. Same thing has happened with chess.
I mean Alpha 0 for chess, not Alpha.
Yeah.
So, Rajesh, so you talk about ICTS for a little bit. By the way, is there anyone, have you been studying for a long time? Go ahead, ask a question.
Yeah, really enlightening discussion, and thanks for wonderful and fireside chat. Anyway, I had a couple of questions actually. So one is, so right now the LLMs are very reactive, so you ask a question, it gives you an answer. Do you foresee it becoming more proactive? Right? For example, when you talk to the LLM, so it does have your profile, right? So it can, often research is done this way, right? You ask somebody a question and they kind of bounce it off among a bunch of subject matter experts to get their opinion, and then you try to use those, and then you try to build an answer from that, right? So do you in this other scenario where LLMs can become more proactive and kind of maybe come up with some questions to ask you, and try to learn more, just pick your brains or something like that, So along those lines. And the second one, I think you did partially address that, is sometimes the way research happens is through pattern recognition, right? So you, especially in math, right? You literally stumble on new discoveries, right? You run thousands and thousands of examples, and then you see some kind of pattern, you see some kind of and then you can just throw it out and then see. So it can raise questions this way, right? So, and maybe, one way this could happen is, you every day, because these are computation is so powerful, they can just raise some 10 questions out. 98% of these could be, not very interesting, but people could just vote on it, right? This is an interesting problem, worth pursuing further. So, yeah, but just my...
I kind of lost the first question. The
first question is proactive.
Whether LLMs will be proactive. That is, if you think of LLM as a tool, which is what it is, then, building in, so that's what AI agents are going to become. They are going to be programmed to have a certain level of autonomy so that they can query their environment, go find the information they want, right? LLMs by themselves, at this point, given the way they are trained, they don't learn in real time. Once the training is done, you have a fixed system that is literally reactive. That's all it's going to do, right? So having deep learning systems.
You have to be creative to answer questions also, right?
Yeah. So having deep learning systems that are going to quote unquote learn online, which is like continual learning, that's a research area. We haven't solved that problem yet.
I have a question on this, quantum computers with qubits and things like that. So they have a 0 and 1 and a fuzzy state, and it's supposed to do break encryptions when it comes online. So you're talking about large, data search, figuring patterns, and if you can do it very quickly, then I might see some kind of hope in that area. So do you know anything about what's going on in that area with quantum computing and AI?
So I can just very quickly say, of course, quantum computers themselves will take a while to be realized, maybe at least a decade or so. So I don't think that much work is going on in this area. But at the same time, I'm not aware of any theoretical developments which say that you can substantially speed up things related to the kind of algorithms that you have to run or processes you have to run for the current deep learning the networks. I don't think the quantum computers will significantly speed them up. They speed up certain other things like factoring products of primes and so on, but I don't think this is something where there is a significant speed up. But as things evolve and as quantum computers also probably come into existence, maybe things will be different.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really good questions. I do want to invite Rajesh to talk a little bit about ICTS for a few minutes, and then we'll move to the next thing. Yeah.
No, thanks. No, I actually wanted to just make a general point. One of the things that I really liked about Anil's book was how it showed, it was, I think, a great case study of how so many areas of fundamental science, the curiosity-driven research in areas of physics, mathematics, statistics, computer science, neuroscience, control theory, what have you, they were all necessary for the evolution of this subject, and over a long time period, from the 1950s till now, 70, 80 years of research in fundamental inquiry is what has led us to this point. And so I think it's important to recognize that and realize that without that long gestation, without the ecosystem which furthers that kind of inquiry, we would not be able to get the kind of amazing things that we have nowadays. And so that's a very fundamental, and the other part of it, which is in a sense a little sad when you read the book, is that none of these contributions came from India. There weren't any substantial contributions there that arose in India, and you kind of wonder why. And I think what one needs is a deep investment in the fundamental sciences in India as well. I mean, we have, to our credit, I think, given the circumstances from which we emerged in 1947, I think we have created some institutions, we have gone some level from there. But I think it is now right to go to yet another level where we are also in a position to drive developments like these. And I hope it came out in today's discussion. There's lots more. We are perhaps only at the beginning of a new phase of artificial intelligence. And this is where I think India can play a role, scientists working in India, and ICTS, the institution that I head, is fundamentally devoted to curiosity-driven research in mathematical sciences, physical sciences, and even the interface with the biological sciences. That we need to invest in that. I really would like to sort of bring home that point. And ICTS is a young institution. I think we've acquired some very brilliant young faculty who are trained everywhere. I have here, right in the first row, one of our latest faculty members, Raghu, is here visiting from ICTS. He's at Stanford as a visiting faculty member, who's our latest addition to ICTS, but many very good people in multiple areas and in very interdisciplinary areas, and exactly the kind of things that you need to shift these boundaries. We saw about how Hopfield went from physics to biochemistry to sort of neuroscience and machine learning. So I really would like you to, we have some material outside about ICTS. We really are looking for support to grow ICTS into a globally competitive institution which can be the home for breakthroughs, so that the next time when we have the next edition of Why Machines Learn and we sort of progress to that stage, we would have contributions from India in that as well, center stage. So I hope all of you can help make that happen in whatever way you can, and so that's more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Anil, for an amazing conversation, and thank you all. I do want to, events like this need a lot of volunteer effort. And so, starting with Sarang and Mandy, and also, of course, Ashwini. I don't know if she's still here.
Ashwini is there. Thank you so
much. IIT Kanpur Foundation, IIT-KSDAA. I think you need to shorten that. It's too long.
Rajiv is here.
IIT Mana, Rajiv, thank you so much. And of course, Naren for keeping us on track. We were, we couldn't have put this together without his very able help. So thank you so much.
Energy and help, and Naren from the IIT Madras Alumni Association.
I have some token of appreciation for the panel here. So,
thank you, everyone. What a fantastic gathering here. And I know it's dinner time, so I'll be quick. My name is Rajiv Ranjan. I'm the president of IIT Kanpur Foundation, and we are dedicated for the brand promotion of IIT Kanpur. We help raise funds that go to Kanpur for various initiatives. And IIT-SVA, it's a long name, but IIT Kanpur Silicon Valley Alumni Association. That's what it stands for. And thank you for their help. So I have with me a few T-shirts, and I know, first of all, how many people from IIT Kanpur in this crowd? Can I? Oh, woo! I hope you outnumber IIT Madras, right?
And IIT Madras.
Okay, so, but on the stage here, IIT Kanpur outnumbers IIT Madras, right? Okay, so first of all, Rajesh Gopakumar for you.
Thank you.
And if you don't mind, Anil wearing IIT Kanpur shirt. Yeah. And last but not least, this is for you, Shashi.
oh, I'll take it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Anil would have taken it, but he's not going to wear it.
Right.
Hello. So, I'm Naren Naik. I run IIT Mana, which is the Madras Alumni Association. It's been wonderful to have these gentlemen here on stage. Can we give them another round of applause, please? So, again, the IIT Madras Alumni Association is very active in the Bay Area, and nice to see many old faces and a few new ones, or ones who haven't been here, come to our events. So we hope to see them coming to future events as well. We do both professional and social events, so if you're on our mailing list, it's hard to miss them. As a token of appreciation, I got something for Anil. It's a t-shirt. We have multiple colors there. I will hand you yours. I wasn't sure what your favorite color is, neither yours, but we've got t-shirts for everybody.
Thank you very much.
And a nice round of congratulations to all of you.